Hello, as always, this is Jim Rakai, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about chapter 1066 of the One Piece manga. And if you'd like to know why there wasn't a video or so for about a month on this channel, my last video, you can check that out for a health and status update and all that stuff. It got a copyright claim on it because I used some music. I really don't know how to talk about depression and anxiety, without talking about and using music from the Smiths. So the video has been suppressed, so you probably haven't seen it on the algorithm or anything like that. Give it a check out if you'd like to. If not, this video is going to be dealing with One Piece like usual. Now, what's really crazy is I was actually researching this whole tongue idea from this image earlier this week when I could put kind of thoughts together and the time together to do it. And then all of a sudden this chapter dropped with Vegapunk's new full design, I guess, and it was like, hey, what the fuck's going on with that tongue? Well, I actually think I have the answer, so stay tuned for the whole video. Now, before we get into all of that slobbering tongue information stuff like that, we're going to talk a little bit about the rest of the chapter a little bit. And I'm not going to touch too much on the Ohara stuff because I actually have that Idea of Evil video that was coming out, and this chapter actually kind of confirmed a lot of the things I have going on in that video. So I have to make a slight edit to that just to add that Vegapunk showed up there. But I do believe that there's lots going on with entities and information, all going from the Ohara tree into the underworld and netherworld. And a big clue to that kind of is Saul being alive. The name Saul, of course, comes from the Hebrew word shal, which meant asked for. Now, I believe that the entirety of Ohara is a culmination of a wish for the One Piece world to make sense, okay? Now, that kind of sounds really, really crazy on the surface, but I don't mean make sense as in, logical sense. I mean sense as in alchemical metal equations like coins, like the name Nico anagrams to, coin. But I will have much and more on that in the Idea of Evil video that's hopefully coming out the next break week, unless I have another mental breakdown beforehand.
You decided to show up. Now why don't you make it easy on yourself and hold still? Why pound that football head of yours flat?
Before you do, there's something you should know, Harold.
What?
I'm crazy, and you should never hit a crazy person.
Oh, no, it's crazy! If you're so crazy, prove it!
Okay.
1, 2, 3, watch me! Hey! You're crazy.
I'm not. No, I'm not.
But coming back to that Saul name, of course, in Christianity and Judaism, it was the first king of Israel in the Old Testament, as well as the name of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. Well, when we look into the Hebrew etymology of the Saul name a little bit closer, we actually get this word, which is shala, which is to ask or to borrow, or borrowed. Well, I think kind of lifting ideas and using direct references from other series is a form of borrowing, at least in Oda's world, and my world as well. But that, again, I apologize, will make much more sense in the Idea of Evil video. But a big part of that video kind of deals with transcending dimensions and especially kind of going to the underworld or the netherworld. Well, I guess a better way to say it would probably be the underworld kind of rising up into, the actual reality of the, One Piece world and all that stuff. Well, that name, Saul, connects to another Hebrew word, Sheol, which I do believe was also used as kind of a base for Shelob, from Shelob's lair in Lord of the Rings and all of that spider and web terminology and stuff in the, last movie and sixth book or whatever like that. But that Sheol word actually means the Netherworld. So Saul's name directly relates to the Netherworld, verbatim. And I think that that's extremely appropriate because for, 15 years now, for the majority of readers have kind of thought that he was dead, and in some form he's kind of risen from the dead here to be alive and leading the Giants of Elbaf to save these knowledge and books and all that stuff. Now, I really think what's going on here is that the water underneath the tree is actually absorbing the knowledge in some way, as well as what Vegapunk does by reading them. But that's for, another video. The meat, so to speak, of this video is going to be mostly about Vegapunk and what exactly is going on with him this time.
What are you doing, detective? What are you doing talking to my client without me present? You sneaky Pete. We'll talk about it later. Right now, you out. 10 minutes ago. Go on. There are laws, detective. Have your kindergarten teacher read them to you, right? Go grab a juice box, have a nap. Go on. All right.
Because as usual, I have a lot of problems with the general consensus of what's going on in these chapters, and we have to really look no further than Einstein himself in our real world to kind of see some major clues that just aren't adding up with this rotten situation right now on Egghead Island. For one, in some of my other videos, in a lot of my other videos, I've kind of talked about how all of Vegapunk's creations and robots seem to be very similar to animals, and they all seem to be modeled after animals, and even these hoof-putting shoe things seem to be all animal related. Well, the real Einstein was almost a vegetarian. If not for some dietary restrictions, he would have been a vegetarian. So this idea that he's been using animals doesn't seem to sit right with me. Now maybe he's saving these animals by making them slaves, which that doesn't really seem like a great trade-off, but something I think's going on kind of weird with there. And something even more important than that is actually that the real life Einstein, after he died, his brain was stolen. But even more important than that, he actually chose to die. He kind of, here's a quote from him where he kind of considered prolonging life artificially to not be great. So all of these Vegapunk satellite bodies and stuff like that, and then this real Vegapunk thing with a stolen brain, I think are actually not as connected as we might think. One big clue to that being, wouldn't he have known what Bonnie looked like grown up from the Atlas body that saw her earlier? If they all have a connected vision, he would have already known that she was there and grown. So I think that there's a lot going on with these separate entities, and I do not think that this big Vegapunk head, big brain, whatever, is the same thing maybe controlling all of these satellite things. So we'll get to that more at the end of this video when we talk about brains and brands. Now, I was really close in my predictions of what he was going to look like. I really thought he was going to have Vegeta's hair, and he does kind of have that Widow's Peak hairstyle thing here going on, but I thought that his hair would be much more like a piece of celery. I did think it was going to be able to be split apart and kind of emptied out and fill up and grow other things and stuff like that and other people, which it does seem to, at the end of the chapter, imply that he has kind of split up his brain into maybe these other pieces or whatever. But I thought it was going to look like celery, not that it was going to look like one of those moon dog or moon pirate, space pirate type head things with the very elongated heads. So I think instead of counting that one as a W, I'm just going to count that one as a V, because I was close. And you have to check out more of this video on some more V and age V and maybe the 5th iteration of Earth. And just because we're on the subject, I guess, the reason that I think actually that the One Piece world has been called Verth so far is because it's actually like a V, like the Roman numeral 5, like this might be the 5th iteration of the Earth or the 5th iteration of this design, so to speak. And speaking of things that I came really close to getting right, one thing I kind of did get right in part in my last video, the Vegapunk's Wonder Lab video, was that I kind of thought that maybe there was an idea here where there was utilizing black holes to funnel out and control star power. And this, we see in this chapter, Vegapunk's little verbal tick of quasar is actually the cosmic energy that's located inside of a black hole. And another big deal with all that stuff is, the gravity of a black hole is what, can manipulate and control the light. And everything we've seen about Vegapunk, especially this real body's introduction, all has to do with manipulating gravity and, kind of drawing characters close to him and then immediately influencing them to, throw out the rules of gravity, so to speak. And I think that that could be one thing that this apple thing is kind of referencing on the top of his head, where it's Isaac Newton and the apple falling on his head is how he figured out gravity or whatever. I think all that could be at play here, but I don't actually think that that's everything. I think there's lots and lots of hidden, rotten, stinky stuff back here, which we're going to be getting into the rest of this video. And what's really crazy is I was actually looking up a lot of what we're going to be talking about now, which we're going to be getting into kind of like, we're going to start looking at the tongue stuff. And I was actually really focusing on the tongue from this image here. Now that, I know sounds crazy on the surface, but we're just I just want you to look at Luffy's left arm that's raised up here. And obviously it has this band thing here. And I believe that that band right there is the lower jaw of the big bad wolf's mouth, okay? And the arm that extends from it, his left arm, is, would be the tongue of that wolf's mouth. Now, before I lose you, I know that sounds extremely crazy, so let's just look at the definitions of what the word tongue actually means. Now, of course, a tongue is the organ in your mouth, duh. But it's also about 30 other definitions that are all extremely relevant to this thing. Now, we're not going to get to all of them here. But some of them that just kind of pop off right from the beginning, kind of going in order, is like tongue as in language, a speaker of a language, speaking in tongues, all that stuff. Well, tongue can also mean a particular speech pattern, which it seems like the real flesh Vegapunk body seems to have a verbal tick or tongue where he says quasar after every single sentence. But honestly, that's just kind of a palate cleanser for kind of the more important definitions of tongue that we're going to get into right now. One big thing when it comes to tongue is also related to shoes, okay? Obviously the flap of material that goes between the laces and the foot, which kind of blocks that, is the tongue of a shoe. Now, what's very interesting is since we've gone to Egghead Island, no one has any shoes with tongues on them. Of course, they have these horse hoof gravity boot things, which I think is extremely relevant to being horsemen and singling kind of the start of Ragnarok and the start of the final arc and all those things or whatever. But also, most importantly, like most horses and horseshoes, they're put on to an animal to make them do a specific job for someone else. In horses' case, riding them. Which actually makes a whole lot of sense because another definition of tongue is the pole of a vehicle, which is basically like the part they would, use to pull on an ox cart or whatever, the end of which the ox are yoked, which is a fancy way of saying the piece of metal that kind of attaches around them to so they can pull the cart for, the human riding it or whatever, or to pull the goods and stuff in the back. But as I said, I was really kind of researching this tongue stuff all kind of in relation to Luffy, mostly beforehand, because another big definition of a tongue is the clapper of a bell, which really should bring to mind the end of Skypiea and Luffy ringing the bell and all that stuff or whatever. Well, that thing that makes the noise on the inside, that's actually called a tongue. And I know there's lots of stuff going on around, Luffy being Nika and the sun god stuff and all these things, and I'm not going to get into it right here, but interestingly enough, any individual point of flame from a whole fire is actually called a tongue. So you would call that a tongue and that a tongue and this a tongue. Those would all be what's known as tongues of fire. And you have to check out my Vegapunk's Wonder Lab video for more on kind of this stuff or whatever, but I do believe that Vegapunk is utilizing star energy in some way, and he's funneling it and then reforming it and rematerializing it for other purposes or whatever. And I think that makes a lot of sense with this individual point of flame from a fire type thing, because when we use our brains and think a little bit abstractly about what's going on here and the wordplay at use, if tongue can mean language, and language is obviously controlling the muscles in a very acute way to make language and to make meaning and to make words and all that stuff, well, I think in a very real way, Vegapunk is using his, a tongue in a sense to create language, to create meaning and new forms of things, basically using fire from a star, I guess, in this case. But before I lose you on all that stuff, a tongue is also nautically a short piece of rope spliced into the upper part of standing backstays. It's also the upper main piece of a mast composed of several pieces. Now, I think that there's a lot going on with masts and broken masts, and Usopp's one of them, and other pieces and all this crazy stuff or whatever. But it's also in the One Piece logo, that rope that kind of bits into the mouth, that's the skull that makes the O or whatever in the logo. That is technically what would be called a tongue if we turn it sideways and think of this as a mast. But it also, even without doing all that turning the sideways thing, since we don't see a tongue in the skull's mouth, we could, kind of use our imagination and view this whole rope as the tongue kind of sticking out like a snake, swirling around the words of the One Piece logo. And then the last thing that we're kind of going to lick with this tongue stuff is this definition of a tongue being a reed for like musical instruments and all those things or whatever craziness. Well, what's really funny is actually one of the definitions of reed is actually a missile projectile, like a missile weapon. So all these rockets and everything we see, all kind of relate to that word tongue, maybe. And what's really interesting is I know this chapter ends with Shaka wanting to show that group of the Straw Hats something. I think that since we're probably going to get devil fruit stuff, maybe when we go to Elbaf or something like that, if we go there or whatever, I think that what he might want to show them might be a rocket. But that might be too small-brained, honestly. So let's finish off this video by ending what the chapter ends on, which is the biggest brain in the world. Because that brain word is kind of extremely crazy, especially if you're a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, before we get into the really, really cool and fun kind of definition connections that have to do with brain and Bran and all these things, I think there's a huge chance that Vegapunk might actually possess the brain fruit. Like a devil fruit that's something with like knowledge or brain power, or maybe like he can take down knowledge like a dictionary or a book and kind of recollect it and keep it, you know, stored in his head or whatever. I honestly almost wonder that if maybe he can like lick something and like it's like taking a photocopy of it and he can have it like a photographic memory to recall all this information and knowledge by licking the ink and licking the page of a piece of paper and gain his knowledge in some way. And that might actually even extend to just every single thing that his tongue touches maybe. But that's kind of on the crazier end. When he meets with Dragon even mentions how his head's grown since the last time they met. So I really wonder if there's something going on with that. And in Japanese, brain fruit would actually translate to the no me, which just seems like too fun of a wordplay for Oda to pass up. So I'm really putting a lot of my money betting that Vegapunk here has the brain fruit, but we'll see. If he does in fact have that fruit, I wonder if his ability to separate it into all these other bodies and this whole apple thing going on here might all relate to that, and maybe how he's been able to learn how to separate devil fruits and put them into inanimate objects and so on. And if you want just like have a really kind of crazy theory for free in this video that has nothing to do with Vegapunk here, I actually think that Gold D. Roger's head from the first page is what becomes, maybe his brain, is what becomes the gum fruit in some form in chapter 1, but I will have future videos kind of proving that one. Sadly, it is way too much to go into in this video. But as a little teaser, I think that kind of might be how some devil fruits are formed, is, you know, a sort of like fruity brain type thing. And then I think a alternate version of it is, you know, people's hearts, which is what I think Blackbeard ate Whitebeard's heart to get his fruit. I think that those might be two separate forms of devil fruits in some way. But like I said, those will all be in, you know, in future videos, probably next year. Now, I would almost say that this apple thing that's going on here with Dr. Vegapunk's, I'm just gonna call it his real body because it just seems like an old man, and all of this stuff and everything else kind of maybe kind of seems robotic or in some way. I mean, they even call them like satellite bodies or whatever, but I would almost say that all of this relates to Johnny Appleseed, but I don't actually think that's the case. It might, but I really think that that's much more Roger's cup of tea from the very beginning. This apple that's going on here, I think, is mainly relating to brain, like the, you know, the words say at the bottom of the page that Vegapunk is the biggest brain in the world. Well, obviously right now it looks like he has no brain, but as I said earlier, I think it's because he's probably split up his brain into all of these satellite bodies. Now, I'm assuming that everyone watching this video knows what a brain is, because they conceivably have to have one to kind of be able to perceive and pay attention and memorize things and feel emotions and take actions. Those are all the things that the brain does as a control center of any body. Now, of course, if you're a Kanye West fan and you're in a plane, you know that, you know, brain can also mean oral sex, but I don't really think that Oda's referencing that. But he could be. Something I think he's much more likely to be referencing here is kind of, as a verb, brain kind of means to dash out the brains of, or to strike, or to destroy, or to put an end to, which I do think that Vegapunk is ultimately trying to do. That he's ultimately trying to put an end to this cycle of the Earth kind of destroying itself and rebirthing itself and all of this stuff. Why? We'll get to in other videos, but I believe that he is trying to stop the, or I won't get into it, I'll just get into it now. I think that he's trying to end the control that the Marines and world government have over that process. And I think one kind of cool clue to all of that stuff actually is those pacifistas that we've been seeing forever and all that stuff. Well, there's lots of definitions for pacifists and everything, and they all kind of mean to not fight anything or whatever. But we all know that Oda loves video games, and he loves referencing video games and all these things. Well, in video games, a player who attempts the challenge of winning a game without attacking any enemy characters is called a pacifist. And that's actually what I think that Vegapunk is kind of ultimately doing. He's not taking direct action in anything, but he's kind of behind the scenes, and his works are being used by other factions around the One Piece world to maybe, you know, push it more towards whatever ideal world Dragon and Vegapunk might be discussing here. A world where the world nobles and the celestial dragons and the world government does not control, you know, every aspect of it. And I think it's all kind of very similar to kind of Albert Einstein's, which is also, you know, probably a big reference to the whole tongue thing is obviously this picture of him. Well, I think more importantly, his attitude towards the Manhattan Project and ending World War II using a nuclear bomb, and him specifically choosing not to be a part of it, but to not actively go against it or to hinder it. And actually, many historians believe and kind of point to a letter that he took part in sending to President Roosevelt in the 40s after the start of World War II to be the direct cause of America's involvement in the atomic arms race. And while he was a pacifist, yes, this note of encouragement did kind of directly lead to the United States creating the nuclear bomb. Just he wasn't actually a part of it. I think all of that could be being referenced here with this pacifist word. But going back to the brain, now I've had people kind of say, you know, that Oda only speaks Japanese, which is super funny to me, because literally every single time he's ever written out the One Piece as a word or a logo, he writes it out in English. And if you knew how much he loves Disney movies and how much he has to study English to kind of see all the background messages and everything in Disney movies, you'd really kind of drop that idea. And I also actually kind of think on a very real level, limiting Oda to only one language is kind of racist. So if that's your attitude, you can shut the fuck up and leave this video. But if that's not your attitude and you think that Oda is conceivable, that it's conceivable that Oda could possibly be using other languages outside of just Japanese to make clues and to make all these things in the One Piece story kind of, you know, foreshadow them and all of these things, because he's one of the best writers of all time, and every single writer ever plays with letters and words, and they do it outside of the language they speak. I think when Oda says that he doesn't speak English, well yeah, he doesn't, and I only speak English. I don't speak any other language, but I can use a dictionary, I can research letters, I can do all sorts of stuff in foreign languages that have nothing to do with English, and still come to conclusions and meanings outside of my normal tongue. And I believe that he does that all the time. And to limit him to just Japanese, you can miss me with that shit. Because, yeah, I don't actually think Oda's lying here. I'm sure he can't, you know, I'm sure he's truthful that he can't actually speak any language other than Japanese. But I guarantee that he can read it and translate it very easily. And I've been doing this for about 2 years now, and I've already gotten so many crazy different, you know, I've learned so many new words and all these things through, and letters, and how really it's one of those weird things where like you hear that J.R.R. Tolkien was a linguist or whatever, and how could that help with all of this stuff? Well, one of the only real true ways to track history is by following the formation of words and languages. And honestly, you can kind of uncover a lot of secrets about the entire world and alternate histories and crazy things we're not going to get into here, just by following, you know, how a word changed from being said this way and spelled this way to being said and spelled how it is now in every language that exists. And it's actually funny, a huge part of J.R.R. Tolkien's work was actually arguing with many, you know, scholar linguistics about, hey, the way you say this thing came about could not possibly exist the way you say it, because X, Y, and Z in the word itself. You look at the fucking letters. I believe that Oda might be touching on a lot of that same stuff here in his own series, just like how J.R.R. Tolkien did with Lord of the Rings. We talked about Shelob earlier, maybe being a reference to Saul and to steal and borrow. So when we take that brain word, a very interesting etymology source of it is actually in Old Irish, which is Bran. Now that should kind of strike out to you a little bit if you're familiar with the Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire and all that stuff with Bran. Well, even more crazy than that, in Ichiro Oda's first ever one-shot, the main character is actually named Bran. And with that Bran word and name, especially if, like I said, if you've read the Game of Thrones books and stuff like that, well, all that three-eyed raven and crow stuff or whatever, well, Bran actually means crow and raven. And I do think that's kind of a clue to what I've talked about in other videos with all these bird cloud things and stuff like that, and all kind of being the background of the world sort of shaping itself and forming itself around the characters to make a story that can change the world. But that Bran word and brain and all that stuff, the Bran part is kind of really crazy because it can mean sword, specifically a broad sword or a long sword, which originally was actually called a bastard sword. And I think that is very real for literally every single character on the Straw Hat crew, all being kind of in some way a pseudo-bastard. I think it's got a lot of means in Berserk with the brand and all that stuff or whatever, but this kind of a rotten apple idea maybe, with the top of his head and the middle parts missing, like maybe it was a fruit that had to be cut out, like you know, dead parts of a tree have to either be burned out or cut out. Same thing with a vegetable if you want to eat it. And I think that the meaning of Bran being rancid or filth or stench or rotten or foul all kind of relates to this idea of maybe him having to get information and bad things out of his head and put them into other things. But I don't know about that for sure. That's kind of, you know, more on the crazier end. But what's not on the crazier end is that Bran word, one of its sources is from the Dutch brak, which actually meant hound. Now, hound, to me, is kind of another form of the big bad wolf, which I've been talking about for a few videos now. And I do kind of ultimately think that he's kind of here to try to stop that process from happening, whereas the rest of the One Piece world's kind of in the process of making sure that certain characters get fed to it. And that big bad wolf stuff can sound kind of crazy. I understand it, and I will have future videos more directly on how Luffy's kind of doing that. But to end this video, we're gonna just touch back on that tongue word again, because one of the anagrams for tongue is tongue. Well, tongue as a word means a fang. And with that, my name is Jim Rakai. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you've watched all the way through, you might as well subscribe for more craziness and more weekly One Piece videos. And I got some great stuff coming up next week about the FIFA World Cup and how Nika's all a clue to Diego Maradona. I will talk to you all later. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.